The last train out of Millhaven Station leaves at 11,047 every night, and it has never once been late in the 4 months I've worked it. Not by a minute, not by 30 seconds. The doors close at exactly 11,047, the platform signal goes green at exactly 11,047, and whatever is on that train when the doors seal is whatever makes the journey. I used to think that kind of precision was just good railroading. I know better now. The night I finally understood what I was actually doing out here, the train was carrying 6 passengers and something in the last car that I had counted twice and still couldn't account for. 6 tickets sold. 6 names on my manifest. 7 silhouettes visible through the small window in the door, separating my conductor's cab from the passenger section. I stood there with my hand on that door handle for a long time, counting and recounting the shapes in the dim overhead light of that car, and the 7th silhouette sat perfectly still in the rearmost seat and never once turned to look at the window the way every other passenger eventually does. I did not open that door. I walked back to my cab, sat down, and drove the train to the end of the line the way I'd been told to drive it every single night, and when the doors opened at the final stop, 6 passengers got off. I checked the last car myself before I filed my end-of-shift report. The seat at the rear was empty. The headrest had a slight impression in it, the kind you get after someone's been sitting in a seat for a long time. The window beside it was fogged from the inside, in a pattern that didn't match any breath I'd ever seen leave a human mouth. My name is Owen Reeves, and 5 months ago I was between jobs in a way that felt less like a gap in employment and more like a gap in myself. One of those stretches where nothing quite fits and everything feels slightly misaligned from where it's supposed to be. My marriage to Claire had ended the previous spring. Not badly exactly, not with shouting or dramatic confrontation, just a slow mutual understanding that we'd become different people than the ones who'd made promises to each other, and that neither version was wrong, just incompatible in ways neither of us had seen coming. I moved into a studio apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking and started answering job listings the way a drowning man answers anything that floats. The posting for a night conductor on the Millhaven Regional Line said nothing unusual, just a requirement for a valid operator's license. Experience with passenger rail preferred but not required, reliable overnight availability, and a pay rate that was better than anything else I'd found. I called the number listed, spoke briefly with a scheduling coordinator who seemed entirely uninterested in my qualifications and almost bored by the conversation, and was told to report to the Millhaven Station supervisor's office the following Monday morning. The supervisor, a thin, precise man named Gerald Hatch who ran the station with the kind of careful stillness that suggested he'd learned long ago not to waste energy on anything unnecessary, shook my hand once, reviewed my paperwork in under 2 minutes, and told me someone would walk me through the line's specific operating procedures before my first solo run. I asked him how many stops the overnight run made. He told me 7 outbound, 6 inbound, with a brief turnaround at the terminus. I asked him what the terminus was called. He looked at me for a moment before answering, a pause just long enough to notice without quite knowing why it felt significant. End of line, he said. That's what the schedule calls it. That's what you'll call it too. The man who walked me through my first run introduced himself as Conductor Marsh. No first name offered. A heavyset man somewhere past 60 who moved through the train with the ease of someone who had learned every inch of it over decades of repetition. He showed me the cab controls, the door mechanisms, the emergency protocols, the passenger intercom system. Then, as the platform cleared after our first outbound stop and the doors sealed again, he sat down across from me in the cab and set a laminated card on the console between us, edges worn smooth from handling. 7 rules, he said. For this specific line, this specific overnight run, every conductor who's worked this shift gets them. You follow all 7, every run, no exceptions, and you'll be fine. You start cutting corners on any of them, and this line will show you why the rule existed before you had a chance to understand it yourself. He read through them without particular drama. The flat recitation of a man who had said these words so many times, they had lost whatever weight they once carried for him personally, worn down to simple information. Rule 1. The manifest is your Bible. Every passenger who boards this train must have a valid ticket in the system. If someone presents a ticket you cannot scan or verify, you do not let them board. You tell them the system is down and direct them to the station office. You do not let them on. Rule 2. You count your passengers at every stop, outbound and inbound. You do your count silently. You mark it in the log. If your count ever comes up higher than your manifest, you do not announce it. You do not make it known to the other passengers, and you do not open the connecting door to the passenger cars until you reach the next scheduled stop. Rule 3. The rear car of this train is locked on every overnight run. It is not a passenger car. It is not storage. You do not have the key to it, and you do not need the key to it. If a passenger asks about the rear car, you tell them it is out of service. Rule 4. Between stops 4 and 5 on the outbound run, the train passes through a tunnel that takes approximately 4 minutes to clear. During those 4 minutes, you do not use the intercom, you do not open any doors, and you do not look at the tunnel walls through the cab window. You keep your eyes on the instrument panel until the light changes. Rule 5. If the emergency brake engages on its own between scheduled stops, you wait 90 seconds before resetting it. Not 89, not 60. 90 full seconds. Whatever stopped the train needed that long, and you do not want to be moving again before it's finished. Rule 6. The end-of-line terminus has a waiting area that is lit and a section beyond the platform that is not lit. You do not go past the platform edge at the terminus. You do not investigate the sounds that sometimes come from the unlit section. You complete your turnaround, and you leave on schedule. Rule 7. Marsh paused here, picking up the laminated card and turning it over in his hands like he was deciding whether to read this one directly or from memory. He read it directly. If you ever find a ticket in the cab after a run that wasn't there when you started, a ticket with no passenger name and no origin station printed on it, you put it in the lockbox under the console, and you do not mention it to anyone at the station. You give it to me the next time you see me, and only to me. I asked him the same question I imagined every conductor before me had asked, what exactly those tickets meant, and why they needed to go to him specifically. He looked at me for a long time before answering, long enough that the train's rhythm under us filled the silence with its steady mechanical pulse. I've been collecting them for 11 years, he said. When I figure out what they mean, I'll let you know. He got off at the third stop outbound and left me alone with the laminated card and 6 passengers and whatever the rest of that first night intended to teach me. Before I keep going, something for those of you who've been asking. I started a second channel for shorter, standalone horror pieces. No rules format, just pure story. Link is in the description if that interests you. Drop a location or premise in the comments too, because I do read them when I'm planning what to write next. Now, back to the Millhaven line. The first 3 weeks ran quiet in a way that almost convinced me the rules were overcaution from a man who'd spent too many years alone on a night train. Most passengers on the last run were workers finishing late shifts. The occasional traveler who'd missed an earlier connection. Sometimes a handful of college students heading back to campus after a night out. I counted them at every stop, silently, the way Marsh told me to, marked my log, watched the tunnel between stops 4 and 5 with my eyes locked on the instrument panel until the cab filled with daylight again, and filed clean reports every morning without incident. Rule 3 tested my curiosity more than any of the others during those first weeks. I walked the length of the train most nights during the inbound run, checking on passengers, and that locked rear car door pulled at my attention every single time I passed it. The window in its door was dark. Whatever mechanism that should have let light from the car into the corridor clearly disconnected or covered from the inside. I pressed my ear against it once, just once, on my 9th run, and heard nothing except the rhythm of the train itself, and, somewhere underneath it, a sound that might have been the car's ventilation system or might have been something else entirely. A low, slow, rhythmic sound I couldn't fully identify and decided not to try. Rule 5 found its first test on a Thursday night, 3 weeks in, empty train on the inbound run, every stop cleared, nobody left aboard. Between stops 3 and 2, the emergency brake engaged hard enough to jolt me forward against the console, the kind of stop that would have thrown standing passengers off their feet. I checked my watch, set the 90-second count in my head, and sat in the sudden stillness of a stopped train on a dark stretch of track, listening to whatever surrounded us in that moment. The track ran through a section of wetlands on the inbound leg, marsh grass and standing water on both sides. No structures, no light sources beyond the train's own forward beams cutting out across the rails ahead. At 63 seconds, something moved in the wetlands to the left of the train, a shape large enough that its movement displaced the marsh grass in a wave that rippled outward from whatever it was, moving parallel to the track for a long moment before veering away into the dark. I kept my eyes on my watch. At 90 seconds exactly, I reset the brake. The train moved on, and I filed the brake event as a routine safety engagement in my end-of-shift report without specifying what I'd seen or heard during the wait. The passenger count first came up wrong on my 22nd run, a Friday night with more riders than usual, 11 names on the manifest. I counted 13 at the first stop, outbound. Recounted twice. Got 13 both times. Rule 2 said, don't announce it. Don't open the connecting door to the cars until the next scheduled stop. I drove the 3 minutes to stop 2 with my jaw tight and my eyes on the track ahead. And at stop 2, I counted again, slow and careful from the cab window as passengers shifted and 2 more boarded. The count came back correct. 13 departures matched by 2 additions brought me to 15, matching the updated manifest with the new boardings. Whatever had inflated the count at stop 1 had resolved itself before I reached stop 2. Either through a counting error I couldn't quite convince myself I'd made, or through something else I was significantly less comfortable considering. The tunnel between stops 4 and 5 was where the line came closest to breaking me. About 6 weeks in on a night with heavier than usual cloud cover that made the darkness outside the cab windows feel more complete than normal. I was 4 minutes into the tunnel passage when the intercom crackled on by itself, the kind of sound that means someone's pressed the passenger to conductor call button in one of the cars. Rule 4 said, don't use the intercom during the tunnel passage. The rule didn't say what to do if the intercom activated on its own, which felt like an oversight I was now paying for in real time, sitting there while that crackle sat open on the line without resolving into a voice or a question, just static, and the suggestion of something underneath it that rose and fell with a rhythm that made the back of my neck prickle. I kept my eyes on the instrument panel. I did not respond. The intercom crackle cut off at exactly the moment the tunnel ended, and the cab filled with outside dark again, like whatever had activated it simply lost interest. The moment the train cleared the tunnel mouth, I found the first unprinted ticket on my 31st run, tucked under the edge of the console in a way that made it impossible to have been there when I started my shift, in a spot I would have needed to place it myself for it to have ended up where it was. Cream-colored paper, the same weight and format as a standard Millhaven regional ticket, blank where the passenger name should have been, blank where the origin station should have been, blank where the destination should have been, blank where the destination should have been except for a single word printed in the destination field in a font slightly different from the rest of the ticket's formatting. I didn't read that word out loud. I put the ticket in the lockbox under the console the way Marsh had told me to, and I drove the rest of that inbound run with my hands very steady on the controls and my mind very carefully on the track ahead. I saw Marsh the following Tuesday, found him in the break room at the station before my shift started, and handed him the lockbox key without saying anything about what was in it. He opened it, looked at the ticket inside without touching it, and closed the box again. He didn't look surprised. He asked me which run it had appeared on. I told him 31 outbound, and he wrote the number in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. He said only that it was the earliest a ticket had appeared for a new conductor in the 11 years he'd been collecting them, and that I should keep following the rules exactly as he'd given them to me, and that someday, probably, the tickets would start making sense. The end-of-line terminus was the rule I broke, the one I had held together against every other test the line had thrown at me across 3 months of runs, until the night a passenger didn't get off. The terminus platform was exactly what Marsh had described, a lit section that ended cleanly at the platform edge, and beyond it, a section of the facility that the platform lights didn't reach, old infrastructure from a time when this line ran further than it currently did, maintenance buildings and signal housing that hadn't been in active use in decades. The sounds from that unlit section were real. I confirmed that for myself the second week, not my imagination filling silence, but actual sound, low and irregular, sometimes close enough to the platform edge that I could hear it clearly from the cab with the door cracked. I never went past the platform edge. Rule 6 was the one I'd held without a single slip. The night I broke it started with a passenger who shouldn't have been on the train at all. A woman, late 40s maybe, had boarded at stop 3 outbound without appearing on my manifest update for that stop, no ticket scan registering in my system, though I'd watched her board with my own eyes. Rule 1 said anyone without a verifiable ticket doesn't board. I hadn't caught it in time, distracted by a question from another passenger at the same moment she'd stepped through the doors, and by the time I processed what had happened, the doors were sealed and we were moving towards stop 4. She sat in the third car, window seat, looking out at the passing dark with an expression I couldn't read clearly from the cab window, but that registered as something between exhausted and somewhere she'd been before. She didn't move much. She didn't interact with the other passengers. She rode all the way to the terminus without getting off at any intermediate stop, and when the doors opened at end of line and every other passenger filed out onto the platform, she stayed in her seat. I waited until the platform cleared. She was still there, still looking out the window, though there was nothing to see out that window except the edge of the lit section giving way to the dark beyond. I keyed the intercom, told her this was the last stop, that the train was turning around. She didn't respond. I keyed it again, same message, same silence. I stood up from the cab and walked through the connecting doors to the third car myself, something I had been careful not to do between stops, but we were at a full halt, and I had run out of other options. I stood at the front of that car and told her directly, out loud, that this was the terminus, and I needed her to exit the train. She turned to look at me then, the first time in the entire run she'd moved from that fixed position looking out the window, and what her face showed in the moment she turned was not surprise at being addressed, and not the mild irritation of a tired traveler being asked to move. It was recognition. The specific look of someone who had been waiting for a specific person to finally do a specific thing, and that person was me. She pointed toward the window, toward the unlit section of the terminus beyond the platform edge. I walked off the train onto the platform instead of following that gesture. I stood under the terminal's lights with my back to the unlit section and my hand on my radio, and I told myself, with more force than should have been necessary, that Rule 6 existed for exactly this reason, and that whatever she was pointing at was something the rule had been written specifically to protect me from needing to see. When I turned back to board the train, the car was empty. She was gone, the way the seventh silhouette had been gone that first night. I'd counted wrong. No footsteps on the platform, no figure moving toward either exit. Just an empty seat with the faint impression of someone who had been sitting in it longer than the 40-minute ride from Millhaven Station could account for. I found a ticket in the cab on the return run. Same cream paper, same blank fields. Except this time the destination line wasn't blank. This time it had 2 printed fields. A destination I didn't recognize and, below it, in that same slightly off font, my name. I put it in the lockbox. I drove the inbound run on schedule. I filed my report without incident noted. The second emergency brake event came about 2 weeks after the first, same stretch of wetlands on the inbound leg, same hard stop, same 90-second wait. This time I watched the wetlands from the cab window openly, rather than trying not to look, and what I saw in those 90 seconds was different from the first time. No movement in the marsh grass. No large shape displacing the reeds in a wave. Instead, a light, single and pale blue, stationary about 40 yards off the track in the standing water. The kind of light that has no obvious source and no obvious purpose in a section of wetland with no structures and no road access. It stayed fixed for exactly the length of my wait, and when I reset the brake and the train began to move, it didn't follow and it didn't fade. It simply stopped being visible, the way things stop being visible when you've moved past the angle that made them visible in the first place, and I drove the rest of that inbound run, trying to decide whether what I'd seen was something the line was showing me deliberately or something I'd happened to catch at the wrong moment. I mentioned it to Marsh the next time I saw him, without mentioning the light specifically, just asking in general terms whether the wetland section ever produced unusual observations during the brake wait. He looked at me carefully before answering, the way he looked at me whenever I pushed against the edges of what he was willing to discuss, and said only that the brake engaged on that section for reasons the line had never chosen to explain to him in 11 years. And that the 90-second rule existed because something in that location needed that precise amount of time for reasons neither of us was qualified to understand yet, and that whatever I might observe during the wait was mine to carry and not particularly his place to contextualize. I started keeping a separate personal log around that time, distinct from the official end-of-shift reports, recording details I couldn't include in official documentation without raising questions I had no good answers to, passenger counts that corrected themselves between stops, the specific quality of the intercom static during the tunnel, the sounds from the rear car on the nights it was louder than others, which I'd started to notice correlated in some way I hadn't fully mapped yet with the nights. The terminus sounds were also louder, like whatever occupied those 2 points of the run was somehow in communication across the distance between them. The regular passengers started noticing. Me noticing, I think, or at least one of them did. A man who rode the 11,047 outbound most Wednesdays to the 4th stop. A quiet, compact man in his 50s who worked nights somewhere in the industrial district near stop 4 and always sat in the same seat in the second car, started holding his ticket out slightly longer than necessary when I came through to check fares, like he was watching my face rather than waiting for me to scan it. One Wednesday he said, very quietly as I handed his ticket back, that he'd ridden this run for almost 3 years, and that I was doing better than most conductors he'd seen cycle through the overnight shift. I asked him, carefully, how many conductors he'd seen cycle through. He said 4 since he'd started riding, not counting Marsh, who he understood had been here considerably longer, and that the usual tenure was somewhere between 2 months and a season before most of them transferred to a different line without much explanation given to anyone. I asked him if he knew why. He thought about it for a moment, looking out the window at the passing dark, and said he thought most people didn't have the right relationship with not knowing things to last on a run like this one. That some jobs required a man to be comfortable carrying questions without answers indefinitely, and that not everyone was built for that particular kind of patience. He got off at stop 4 without saying anything else, and I stood in the aisle of the second car for a moment after the doors closed, thinking about what he'd said, and about the 4 conductors before me, and about the 2 months to a season that apparently marked the average tenure of someone unwilling or unable to settle into the uncertainty this line required. The following Wednesday, he wasn't on the train, nor the Wednesday after that. I checked the manifest both nights out of a habit I hadn't consciously developed until he wasn't there to confirm it, his name absent both times from the list of scanned tickets. I thought about asking Marsh whether long-term regular passengers on the overnight line sometimes simply stopped appearing, the way some questions on this line simply stopped having obvious answers, and decided I already knew what Marsh would say, which was some careful version of the same thing. The Wednesday man himself had said that some things on this run you carried without resolution, and the carrying itself was the point. I saw him one more time, almost a month later, not on the train but on the platform at stop 4 as the train pulled in on an inbound run. He was standing at the far end of the platform near the exit, watching the train come in the way people watch things they've spent a long time thinking about. He didn't board. When the doors opened and the couple of passengers who were getting off at stop 4 filed past him, he simply watched them go, and then watched the doors close again. And as the train pulled away, I watched him through the cab's rear camera until the platform disappeared from the frame, standing exactly where he'd been, not moving toward the exit, not moving toward the track, just standing there with his hands in his coat pockets, in the particular stillness of a man who has arrived, somewhere he meant to arrive, and is simply waiting for whatever comes next. The night the rear car made a sound I couldn't attribute to anything mechanical was about 3.5 months in. A slow Tuesday with only 4 passengers, all of them in the first. I was doing my walkthrough between stops 2 and 3, the train rocking gently, corridor empty, when I reached the door to the rear car and stopped because the sound coming through it was not the ventilation hum I'd catalogued during my ear against the door moment weeks earlier. It was a sound with a pattern to it, not mechanical, not environmental, but deliberate. The specific rhythm of something that understood rhythm, rising and falling in a sequence that repeated itself twice before I made myself step back from the door and walk forward to the first car where my 4 passengers sat, in peaceful ignorance of whatever occupied the car behind them. I tried once, about a month after the woman in the third car, to look up the history of the Millhaven Regional Line's overnight run in whatever public records I could find online, curious whether any of what Marsh had alluded to and what I'd experienced had ever surfaced anywhere in documented form. What I found was sparse. A few local historical society entries about the line's original construction in the late 1800s, some decommissioning notices from the mid-20th century when several of its extensions had been retired, and a brief mention in a regional transit authority document from about 15 years back about the overnight service being maintained at reduced capacity. Nothing about the end-of-line terminus by that name, nothing about the tunnel between stops 4 and 5, nothing that mapped onto any specific part of my experience in a way that gave it context or history or an explanation I could hold on to. I found one other thing, almost by accident, in a digitized archive of a local newspaper from the 1940s, a brief item about a rail worker who had reported an incident on the late-night run on this line. The details vague in the way newspaper accounts of unexplained things are always vague, but mentioning specifically a passenger who rode to the terminus without a valid ticket, and who could not be located after the train completed its turnaround. The rail worker quoted in the piece described the passenger only as a woman, window seat, rear car of the train. The item noted that the rail worker had resigned his position the following week and could not be reached for further comment. I thought about that article for a long time, doing the rough arithmetic of decades between that account and my own night with the woman in the third car, wondering whether the line had been having versions of that same experience since the 1940s, and whether the 7 rules were the accumulated result of every rail worker who'd encountered it, and tried to codify what they'd learned into something that might protect whoever came after them. The third ticket appeared on my most recent run, 2 nights ago. Same lockbox placement, same cream paper, But this time, 3 fields were filled instead of 2. A destination I still didn't recognize. My name in the second field, and in a third field that hadn't been present on either of the first 2 tickets. A date, 6 weeks from now, printed in the same slightly off font as everything else on those blank tickets. Specific enough that I found myself running through what I'll be doing 6 weeks from now, with the particular sharpness of a man who has been told something about that date without being told what it means. I put it in the lockbox. I'll give it to Marsh when I see him next, the way I've given him the others. I think about Claire sometimes on the quiet runs, the same way I think about a lot of things that used to occupy more of my attention before this job filled the space they left behind. I think about how I used to find uncertainty uncomfortable, how I used to need things to resolve into something nameable before I could set them down and move on. This line has been teaching me, slowly and without asking my permission, that some things don't resolve and we're never going to resolve, that the uncertainty isn't a problem waiting to be fixed but simply the nature of the territory, and that the only real question is whether you can learn to move through it without needing it to become something other than what it is. That's what the Wednesday passenger meant, I think, about having the right relationship with not knowing things. The conductors who left after 2 months or a season weren't leaving because the line was too dangerous or too strange. They were leaving because they couldn't stop wanting it to make sense, in a way it was never going to make sense, and that wanting had worn them down until staying felt worse than the uncertainty of what came next, somewhere else. I don't know what the tickets mean. I don't know what's in the rear car or what occupies the unlit section of the terminus, or why the brake stops in the wetlands for exactly 90 seconds. I don't know what the woman in the third car was pointing at, or whether I'll understand the date on the third ticket when it arrives, or whether Marsh's 11 years of collected ticket numbers have been building toward a conclusion he's close to, or one that's still decades off. What I know is that the 11,047 departure leaves exactly on time every single night, and that the 7 rules have kept me functional across 4 months of runs that would have broken something in a man less willing to sit with the questions this line asks without demanding they answer themselves on his schedule. I know that the count always corrects by the next stop. I know that 90 seconds is always enough. I know that the tunnel ends, so I stay. I show up at 11,030 every night. I run my pre-departure checks. I count my passengers silently at every stop, and I drive the last train out of Millhaven Station to an end of line that isn't on any public map I've ever found, following 7 rules I didn't write and don't fully understand and have no intention of stopping. Some nights the run is quiet and the rear car stays silent and the count comes up clean, and the terminus sounds like nothing more than old infrastructure settling in the cold, and I drive home at sunrise thinking about nothing more unusual than what I'll eat for breakfast.